I've been thinking about Valyrian steel all week, and I don't just mean the cool factor, the flashy ripples, or the way a blade like that seems to drink the light. I mean what it actually is in the world, the technology, the theology, the politics, the psychology, and why, if you look closely, it might be the single most expensive form of storytelling in Westeros. A Valyrian blade is an argument you can swing. It's inheritance you can sharpen. It's legitimacy with an edge. And if you think about it, every time someone draws one in a book or on screen, the room temperature drops because everybody present understands the unspoken math. A person with Valyrian steel has history in their hand. That's the part people miss. They talk about how light it is, how it holds an edge, how it can turn a knight's helm into scrap. And yeah, all that's great. But the metal is only half the trick. The other half is the story that smelted it. Let's back up a bit, because before you can talk about the true power of this stuff, you've got to remember the context. The old Valyrian freehold wasn't just a country. It was an operating system. Dragons were air superiority, sure, but the day-to-day gravity of their civilization was craft, roads and vaults, and fused stone architecture. And this entire industrial culture of we do things you can't. That's what Valyrian steel represents. It's the bite-sized relic of a world that solved problems at an inhuman scale. The magic and the metallurgy were braided together so tight you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And then the doom hits, and it's like half the source code gets deleted. Everything that remains turns into legend, which is just what happens when the manual burns and you have to put the machine back together from the shape of its shadow. Now here's the thing about the forging myths. Every culture around Valyria tells a different version because that's how power echoes. You hear one camp swear the blades were folded in dragonfire, not coal, with the smiths singing spells so old the words don't translate anymore. Another camp mutters about blood, human blood in the tempering, life traded for sharpness. People love that story because it's transgressive and it explains why no one can do it now. There are maesters who will tell you with a sniff that folded 1,000 times is nonsense. That's not how metal works, and they're not wrong in the literal way, but they're missing the symbol. Folded 1,000 times is about attention and intention. It's about the idea that the blade got all the time and genius of a civilization that had time and genius to waste. If you think about it, that's what makes the loss of the craft hurt so much. These swords are proof that the world used to be more ambitious. People fixate on what's in the alloy and, look, I'm not going to pretend I've got a crucible in my garage, but the pattern tells on the process. That dark, smoky ripple is not just pretty. Steel makes fingerprints when it's forced to move in certain ways under heat and pressure. When you see that wave in Valyrian steel, you're seeing an echo of the arm that made it. A ghost of the hammer rhythm, the temperature cycles, the quenching medium. And yeah, I'm as fascinated as anyone by the rumor that dragonbone ash or obsidian dust or a pinch of God knows what's in there. But the more interesting bit is the idea that the metal becomes a carrier for intention. The blade remembers what it's told to be. It wants to stay sharp the way a well-trained dancer wants to hit the step even when the stage shakes. You've got to remember the Valyrians weren't shy about mixing their sciences. If you control volcanoes and dragons, you're basically running a lab with the hottest Bunsen burners on Earth. There's this theory that the 14 fires were a giant material science playground. Ores get smelted in places where the air itself is infused with weird elements, and the smiths are not just blacksmiths, they're ritualists, timing quenching with lunar phases, embedding words into the process. And before you roll your eyes at the ritual bit, consider this. Even in our world's metallurgy, timing matters, cooling curves matter, tiny impurities matter. So imagine a culture that took the repeatability of ritual and used it like a tool, not because the gods care, but because the human body is most precise when it performs choreographed acts. Spells might be mnemonics for process. Or, and this is a delicious possibility, they might be both process and power. The maesters who wear that Valyrian steel link to show they studied the higher mysteries are basically admitting there's more going on than we can predict by temperature and carbon content alone. If you think about the doom as an industrial catastrophe, the scarcity of the blades makes sense. Knowledge bottlenecked to a few city-states, passed down like recipes guarded by paranoid families. Qohor, famously, can rework Valyrian steel, which makes the city feel like a repair shop for the gods. They can't make new cars, but they can tune the engines and respray the body. That's why blades get recolored, right? The deep black takes on hints of red or gold when a Cohoric master lays hands on it. And I love that because it's a perfect metaphor for how culture rebrands stolen power. A conquered house gets their ancestors' sword back, now with their colors singing in the steel. And suddenly the narrative is, we've always owned this story. That's the function of heraldry baked into a weapon. Zoom in on the handling for a second. Everyone says Valyrian steel is light, and the word is doing too much and not enough. It's not feather light, it's responsive. The balance point sits where your intent sits. You feint, the blade wants to carry through. You parry, the blade slides like water instead of chattering. It doesn't chew up on bone the way imperfect steel does. And edge retention, the phrase we all glibly throw aroo. And D is really about trust. If you're marching into a battle or across a wasteland in winter, trusting your edge not to roll or chip is the difference between running your plan and constantly babysitting your gear. That's why a good blade makes you braver. It reduces cognitive load under stress. The sword pays attention so you don't have to. That's magic no one talks about. But the material excellence is not what got these blades mythic. The politics did. Watch what happens every time a Valyrian steel sword changes hands. It's never just a transfer of property. It's an adoption, a promotion, a claim. When Jeor Mormont gives Longclaw away, he's not simply gifting a sword. He's naming a successor in spirit, rewriting lineage with iron. When the Lannisters melt down ice after a war and recast it into 2 new blades, they're not just salvaging material. They're chopping up a rival family's narrative and hammering it into trophies, then painting their colors over it. That act is propaganda you can stab with. Look what we did to your values, the blade says. We broke them and put them to work for us. And yet, in a twist that tells you just how unruly history is, one of those reforged blades ends up in the hands of a knight whose entire code is built on keeping promises, so the stolen steel is enlisted in a counter-argument. That's the thing about weapons. Once they're out in the world, they accumulate meanings the way they accumulate nicks. The truest owner is the person who can make the blade's story louder than anyone else's. Let's talk origin myths, because those are always telling on the people who repeat them. The tempered in blood idea, for instance, sounds horrifying, but what it's really about is cost. It says, the price of greatness is a life. We adore stories that require an awful trade because we want to believe power is earned. The Valyrians, for their part, would probably laugh and say the price was study and control, the discipline of dragon lords who domesticated fire, which is its own kind of bloodless brutality. Let's be honest. Another myth says the swords were quenched in dragonfire itself, and that one's fun because it puts dragon and blade into a feedback loop. Dragon creates sword that kills things dragons can't, like those icy beings from the far north. If you squint, that story sets up a balanced ecosystem of powers, not just a hierarchy. Fire begets metal that can stand against cold that devours fire. Honestly, from a narrative engineering standpoint, it's perfect. One thing you've got to remember about the true power is how it behaves in a room before anyone moves. If you walk into a hall and see a Valyrian longsword across a lord's knees, your brain does 3 things in rapid succession. 1, it reads status, this person has something you can't buy anymore. 2, it reads competence, this person or their ancestors were dangerous enough or important enough to hold on to it. 3, it reads continuity, this house plans to be around long after your dust. That trifecta is a cheat code in feudal politics. You can collect titles and lands, sure, but those can be argued. A Valyrian blade ends arguments. It says, we were here before your grandfather, and we will be here after your grandchildren. That's why lords will bankrupt a treasury to reclaim an heirloom sword. They're not buying metal. They're buying past and future at the same time. Sometimes people ask, okay, but how many are there? And the answer, deliberately, is not enough. Scarcity fuels reverence. There are more names than there are hands to hold them. Heartsbane, Longclaw, Oathkeeper, Widow's Wail, Lady Forlorn, Nightfall, Lamentation, Red Rain, Blackfire, Dark Sister. The names alone are poetry, right? Half the power is that you can say the name of a blade and conjure a lineage, a trauma, a victory. Blackfire doesn't just signify a sword. It signifies a political movement, a family schism stretched across generations. Dark Sister doesn't just signify a weapon. It calls up a certain style of war, lean, decisive, lethal from the shadows, carried by specific hands over centuries. This is branding in a brutal world. The blades become mascots of ideologies. You notice how few of these are nameless? You name what you revere, what you fear, what you want to make immortal. And then you have the outliers that test the category. Dawn from House Dane isn't Valyrian steel. It's stranger, brighter, arguably older, forged from a star that fell. I bring it up because it reminds us that even in a universe where Valyrian steel is the gold standard, there are other standards. Power doesn't like monopolies. Dawn says, there are different paths to exceptional. That complicates the mystique in a good way, because it makes the Valyrian blades less a miracle and more a chapter in a larger story of cultures solving the same problem: how to make a piece of metal carry meaning, and arriving at different answers. If you think about it, that's what keeps the whole ecosystem healthy. You want swords with different philosophies attached to them. You want friction. Friction makes sparks. Let me pivot to use case, which is less romantic but just as revealing. A Valyrian sword is not a farm tool. You don't take it to cut brush. That restraint is a kind of liturgy. The blade's life is dense but curated. Duels, executions, battles that historians will argue about for centuries. You've seen how certain lords perform justice with their blade. You've seen how a sentence spoken and a stroke of steel combine to make a moral theater. That's not incidental. The metal's greatness amplifies the ritual. If the steel never chips, the performance feels pure. The subtext is the law doesn't wobble, which is the point of using a family sword for judgment. You're not just punishing a person, you're telling your people our house's code is honed and unbending. Of course, the irony is that the person holding the sword decides what law is that day. But the theater works because the tool is so frighteningly good. Now, about the north and the cold. On screen, we've watched a Valyrian blade cut through a being made of winter like the statue is brittle glass. And from a mythic standpoint, that's perfect. Ice meets forged fire. If you're a fan of the textual canon only, the evidence is more inferred, more whispered through lore. Dragonglass, obsidian, proves the principle that certain materials carry ancient antipathies. It would make a kind of structural sense if Valyrian steel sits in the same family of frozen fire tools, set up ages ago as counters in a game the living didn't know they were still playing. Whether you're show-leaning or book-leaning, the narrative function is clear. When existential threats return, the world coughs up old solutions. The swords are seeds from a previous climate. In terms of storytelling, that's such a satisfying click. You get the thrill of rediscovery without the deus ex machina feeling of, this came out of nowhere. Didn't. It was always there, in attics and above hearths, sleeping. We should talk about whose hands these blades end up in, because the distribution is basically a map of political gravity. It's not random. Houses with deep roots, houses with charisma, houses that survive collapses, they hold the metal. Even when they lose it, notice how the sword gravitates toward a kind of narrative equilibrium. Run the tape. A house falls. The sword is stolen, or ransomed, or recast. Then somehow it finds its way, over years, into a pair of hands that make sense. That's because people conspire to make it make sense. Characters are constantly trying to write a future that vindicates their past. And a Valyrian blade is a glaring, blade-shaped opportunity to do exactly that. You don't just buy one, you court it with deeds. If you've ever tried to change your reputation in a small town, you know how this works. Tools don't just do tasks, they join stories. That's why the marketplace price of a Valyrian sword, the gold someone would pay, is almost irrelevant compared to the social price. You can spend gold, you have to earn myth. Let me get nerdy about the aesthetics for a second, because form is argument. The dark sheen, the feathering along the flats, the way light pools along the fuller. This is not accidental beauty. When your weapon looks like a night river and feels like it wants to move, it changes how you behave with it. Owners develop a kind of relationship that's hard to explain to anyone who's never had a tool that feels, for lack of a better word, alive. You talk to it in your head. You imagine it disagreeing with stupidity. And because people are apes who love animism, that imagined personality feeds back into the legend. Suddenly the sword is not what you hold. It's an entity you consult. You get lines like, "The sword knows." Superstition? Absolutely. But superstition that shapes real decisions is just a different category of cause. There's an uncomfortable thread we have to tug: enslaved labor and the ethics of achievement. The Valyrian freehold didn't build its wonders on volunteer hours. The mines, the forges, the roads. Somebody bled in those places without choice. It's neat to talk about genius and dragons and craftsmanship, but the genius sat on a pyramid of human lives. And the doom, catastrophic as it was, disperses those technologies into a world that then consumes them uncritically. That's how power works. Dynasties fall. Their trophies scatter. The trophies shed their original shame and pick up new meanings. I'm not saying give the swords back, they're imaginary, but the clarity matters. When we admire an artifact, we should trace its costs. It sharpens our admiration into something more honest. You can love an object and refuse the lie that it was made by clean hands. That's part of the true power, too. The ability to force a conversation about the messy origins of greatness. I keep circling back to reforging because it's such a good metaphor for political recycling. Reforging is the alchemy of turning one story into two. Watch the optics. Take a beheading sword, heavy, slow, symbol of cold law, and melt it down into two quick blades that flash in tourneys and war. You've redistributed weight, literally and metaphorically. You've transformed a public instrument of judgment into personal weapons. If that doesn't read as a regime announcing, "We're done with the old way of doing justice. We do action now," I don't know what does. And yet, blades are stubborn about where they want to end up. They respond to character. A sword named Oathkeeper in the hand of a man who spent years breaking oaths is potent irony. Put it in the hand of someone who would die rather than lie, and suddenly the steel is rehabilitated. That's the lore economics of Valyrian weapons. Value fluctuates based on bearer, deed, and narrative momentum. You also have this delicious tension between institutional knowledge and personal skill. The Citadel hoards books and insists on cause and effect while quietly admitting that, yes, someone had to sing to make the best swords. Cohort hoards technique and will take your gold to repaint your heirloom. The free cities hoard the blades themselves, turning them into dowries and diplomatic gifts. Meanwhile, out on the fringes, in the north or the Vale or the Iron Islands, some grizzled warrior sharpens a relic on a stone and swears he can feel the steel humming. Who's right? They all are, in slices. That's the cleverness of the world building. There's no single point of truth where you can plant your flag and say, "Here's the manual." Knowledge is piecemeal, contested, localized, which is how real knowledge usually looks when the lights go out. If you think about the sword as software, updates are impossible. The devs died. All you can do is patch, skin, and optimize. That's where the cohoric recoloring intrigues me. The fact that you can tint the ripples, pulling red OU, tea of black, or gold out of smoke, suggests that the base material is responsive to certain kinds of symbolic intervention. It's like the metal has channels that can be persuaded to flow aesthetically without damaging the function. That should unsettle you, by the way, because it implies the lore is editable. If you can recolor a blade to match your banner, what else can you edit? Names, obviously. Histories, certainly. And at that point, the true power of Valyrian steel starts to look less like indestructibility and more like adaptability. The metal stays itself while letting stories paint it. That's why it's such a durable tool for politics. It tolerates propaganda without losing performance. Let me take a beat on the concept of inheritance you can swing. A sword in a chest is just memory. A sword at the hip is memory that acts. Heirs who inherit these blades also inherit an expectation of behavior. If you're the kid who got Heartsbane, you don't get to be ordinary. The sword will make sure of it. Every time you strap it on, you feel the weight of dead eyes asking if you measure up. That pressure makes decision-making not rational, exactly, but mythic. You start asking, what would the blade want me to do? And then you do that even when it's stupid. This is how an object bends a family. It chooses futures by insisting on a certain kind of past. You get tragic fathers who weaponize the blade as a standard to beat their sons with. You get idealists who run toward doom because the blade whispers honor. You get thieves who convince themselves they're rightful owners because they're the only ones who use it properly. The metal doesn't speak, but it doesn't have to. People volunteer to be haunted. Another angle that's fun to tug on is the way Valyrian steel collapses class distance. A peasant can't ride a dragon or sit a throne, but a peasant can, in theory, pick up a fallen Valyrian dagger and change history in a corridor at midnight. Power that requires infrastructure is elitist and slow. Power that exists in a portable object is chaotic and egalitarian in the most dangerous way. That's why the upper classes obsess over keeping the blades inside their circles. They're trying to corral lightning, because the truth is, a little Valyrian steel in the wrong hand embarrasses armies. It reinforces a core idea of the setting, that the right person at the right time with the right tool can rewrite tomorrow. I have to linger on Blackfire and Darksister because they're the best argument for swords as political parties. Blackfire carries this booming, center-stage energy, official, kingly, the kind of blade you pose with on a coin. It symbolizes the confident, public face of conquest. Darksister moves differently. It's a knife in the weave of history, showing up in hands that like asymmetry, strategy, and precision. The fact that both swords belong to the same dynasty and then went on diverging journeys is so telling. It's the dynasty arguing with itself across centuries. Should we rule by spectacle or by subtlety? The swords are answers people pick up and swear by. And if a single family can host both philosophies, it explains why that family ruled so long. They weren't one thing. They had tools for all weathers. When people say Valyrian steel doesn't dull, I get what they mean, but it's more interesting to say Valyrian steel resists entropy. In a cold, long winter world where everything rots, grain, flesh, governments, a tool that keeps its edge is ideological candy, promises permanence. In a place defined by cycles of plenty and famine, peace and war, summer and winter, a blade that doesn't care what season it is becomes a talisman against decay. That's why you oil it even though it resists rust. It's not just maintenance, it's prayer. You affirm that some things can be kept. The act of caring for an object that doesn't strictly need it is a human being saying, I will participate in your eternity. Let's be honest about fear. People behave better around a person with a Valyrian sword. Not because they're saints, but because fear is a governance tool. Once, maybe twice, somebody watches a blade like that cut through chain, and the story does the rest. Rumor is the sharpest edge. You don't have to duel everyone. You just have to be seen with the thing that can end duels. That's statecraft. You could pass a law, or you could let your heirloom sit unsheathed on the table while you talk. One is paperwork, the other is theater. Theater is quicker. I also love the paradox that these blades are both irreplaceable and routinely risked. If you truly valued them as objects, you'd lock them away. But the more you lock them away, the more they stop being power and start being paperweight. So lords take them into battle where they can be lost. That's rational because the only way a Valyrian sword earns yield is by being seen doing Valyrian things, cutting, winning, surviving. It's a high-risk, high-reward asset, like sailing your treasure fleet into a storm because there's no other way to make port before winter. The entire mystique relies on audacity. You signal belief in your own story by risking the relic that carries it. We can't dodge the way these swords shape strategies. If both sides have regular steel, you can fight in mass with formation logic dominating. Throw a Valyrian longsword into one side, and suddenly dual logic returns. Line commanders have to account for the enemy's champion being able to crack armor or sweep through a flank. That changes deployment, morale, and the timing of engagements. You might even plan provocations to draw the sword out early, try to isolate and overwhelm it, which is insane when you think about it because you're rearranging hundreds of lives around one piece of gear. But that's what talismans do. They bend large shapes, and if your side has one, you design a plan that revolves around getting that blade where it matters most at the moment. That matters most. These are resource allocation problems and religious questions at the same time. We should also look at the inverse case, houses that lost their Valyrian sword. You feel it when you read about them. It's like a cut tendon in a family narrative. They limp. They overcompensate with banners and marriages and gold. But they know something is missing. Sometimes they chase it literally, expeditions into ruins, mercenaries hired to recover treasure. Sometimes they chase it abstractly, sponsoring seps, throwing tourneys, trying to buy the respect that used to come free when the blade hung over the hearth. Loss clarifies identity. Some houses get harder, lean into other competencies. Others become brittle, obsessed, paranoid. The absence becomes a character in the room. And if a lost sword shows up centuries later, in some smuggler's chest, oh, that's a plot engine. That's divine intervention disguised as logistics. You might notice how frequently Valyrian steel is involved in oaths, sworn brotherhoods, vows kept and broken, promises that matter so much they need a physical emblem. The steel acts like a notarizing stamp on the soul. You swear by it because it's older than your mood and sharper than your temptations. That ritual is not just drama, it's neurochemistry. Humans need anchors. We're more likely to keep a commitment when we can point to an object and say, "That is what I promised on." And if the object is famous, social pressure does half the work. Breaking an oath sworn on a relic feels like breaking an oath sworn to history. So the swords become moral prosthetics. They make it easier to be good, or at least to be consistent. There's a delightful pettiness to the way colors get involved. Recoloring a blade is branding warfare. It's not just pretty red and gold. It's this blade now lives in our story. You can hate the conqueror and still feel a tug in your gut when the light catches a ripple that matches their banner. That's propaganda at the molecular level. And it works because aesthetics aren't neutral. They're shortcuts to belonging. Someday in the far future, a scribe will write that so-and-so's blade was black shot through with the crimson of their house. And the description will carry as much political information as a page of treaty law. Art wins arguments by sneaking past your defenses. When I try to distill the forging myths to their useful core, I land on 3 pillars: mastery of heat, inclusion of the unusual, and ritual precision. Mastery of heat because heat is time in metallurgy. Inclusion of the unusual because purity is overrated when the unusual brings gifts, trace elements, ashes, bones, who knows, things that alter grain and introduce behaviors you want. Ritual precision because humans aren't machines. We need song and rhythm to do the same thing the same way every time. Whether the song does anything metaphysical is almost beside the point. Keeps the apprentice's hands moving in sync. It regulates breath. It makes the act bigger than the worker, which, let's be blunt, is how you get people to endure hard, hot, dangerous labor without losing their minds. And then there's the silence around the exact method, which serves a function, too. Secrets create dependency. The fewer people who can fix your blade, the more you will tolerate their price and their attitude. That's why the city of Qohor feels like a monopoly that refuses to explain itself. From the outside, we call that mystery. From the inside, it's leverage. If you think about it, the Doom didn't just break buildings and dragons. It created a permanent market condition. Scarcity-backed authority. The world's supply of answers shrank, and anyone with even a slice of the answer gained a throne they didn't have to defend with soldiers, only with silence. Let me paint a mental image that gets at the human side. Picture a lord in a drafty hall at midnight, everyone asleep, fire guttering. He takes the family sword down just to hold it, not to use it. He runs his thumb along the fuller, stares at the mirrored wobble of firelight in the steel, and tries to feel the way his grandfather must have felt during some famous hour. He's not practicing, he's communing. That's the drug of legacy. The blade is a bridge across dead generations, and standing on that bridge steadies him. Tomorrow he has to tell a hungry village there'll be no grain. Tomorrow he has to propose a marriage no one wants. Tonight he borrows courage from a piece of metal that has watched men he loved make worse choices and survive. If you've ever held your grandmother's ring or your father's jacket before a hard day, you know exactly what this feels like. That's the true power again, this time gentler but just as real. On the battlefield, edge case behaviors matter. There are tales of Valyrian steel cutting through common steel without losing temper, and while we can nitpick physics, the practical result is that a duel with one of these blades doesn't last long. It's not just the edge, it's the confidence. Your footwork changes when you trust your tool. You commit earlier, you follow through harder. There's a psychological warfare. The opponent knows what your sword is and hesitates. Hesitation is a time tax. Battle is paid in those taxes. So the advantage compounds. A Valyrian blade creates a future where you are more likely to be the kind of person who wins. That's not fair. Power never is. And just because I love a good inversion, sometimes the blade destroys its owner. Not by turning in the hand, that's superstition, but by inflating the ego attached to it. I can't lose. I have the sword. Famous last words. When a person mistakes a tool for destiny, they start skipping steps. They stop counting. They think the story owes them a victory. The world loves to punish that specific laziness. You'll see the other kind of tale, where the person with the ordinary spear beats the person with the legendary sword because eager and humility beat spectacle when spectacle gets sloppy. That's a valuable countermyth. It keeps the rest of us from despairing. It tells us the blades are wonderful, but not gods. You've got to notice how often women in this world end up associated with blades that read as surgical rather than blunt. That's partly because of who's allowed on certain battlefields, and partly because story loves to attach the language of precision to characters whose power comes from moving through tight corridors, literal and political. I like that a lot. It expands the vocabulary of heroism. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to own a dangerous story. Sometimes you just have to be the person who knows exactly where to put the point. It's funny, too, how Valyrian steel makes people argue about authenticity. If a sword's name is older than the person holding it, which identity is truer, the blades or the bearers? Purists want a one-to-one. House X must hold blade Y or else history is broken. Pragmatists shrug. Whoever uses it well deserves it. The tension is productive because it makes characters talk about what deserve even means. Bloodline, merit, need, fate. The blade becomes a mirror that shows people what sort of moral math they're running in their heads. And yes, sometimes the compromise is simple bribery dressed up as destiny. Humans are good at that. Let me end the stretch by drawing the circle tight. When people say Valyrian steel's true power, they're trying to reconcile two facts. First fact, as material, it's superb, light, hard, flexible, durable, with a predatory edge. Second fact, as symbol, it's overwhelming, old, storied, scarce, and loud. The reconciliation is this: the material excellence underwrites the symbol so the symbol can do real work. If the swords were brittle junk, the legend would collapse. If they were superb but common, the legend would stagnate. Instead, they live in the sweet spot where function feeds myth and myth selects for function. The blades end up where they'll be most seen, in hands that will most amplify them, doing deeds that will most echo. That's not magic in the fireworks sense. That's magic in the system sense. It's a cultural feedback loop disguised as a shiny knife. So when someone steps into frame with a Valyrian blade, don't just see steel. See governance. See ancestral sin. See marketing. See a to-do list written by dead men and carried out by a living one. And ask, in that quiet way no one else can hear, what does the blade want right now? Because the people who keep these swords have asked themselves that for generations, and the answer has built cities and started wars and ended bloodlines and saved winters. The edge you can touch is only half the edge. The other half is the line it draws through time. And if you think about it, that's sharper than anything.